Okay guys, welcome back. So it's time to make all the magic start to actually happen now. What we're going to do is we're going to get the fire button working. We're going to add a couple of sound effects and we're going to do something called raycasting. Now, raycasting is a technique used in many games, especially things like first-person shoot-'em-up games and things like that. Now, what Unity has the ability to do, if I switch to the 3D view for a second and look at the camera, we can fire a laser from the center of the camera straight out into the scene. Now, what will happen is if the bird and the collider pass in front of this laser, we can detect that connection. So what we're going to do is hook up the button on the game view so that when we press that button, we will fire a laser from the center of the camera, and if the bird is in the sights, then we can detect that hit collision and we can destroy the bird and score a point, remove a shotgun shell or add shells, and act accordingly, play sound effects and everything else. So things will really start to come together now. So I'll just jump back up to the canvas for a second. Now, what I'm going to do is I want to go to the image target and I want you to right click and create a new empty game object. Okay, now this game object is going to be called Raycast. Okay, and it will have a script attached. So let's add a component called Raycast controller. Okay, create and add. There we go, and now we have a new script. And what I want you to do is come down to the script and drag that into the scripts folder. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the notes. We're going to create a raycast script. We've already done that. I've just explained what raycasting is. We're now going to create a bunch of variables that we need to play the game, basically. This script will also need to be accessible via other game objects. So for example, the fire button will need to be able to call the fire function and fire our raycast. It will also then play the sound effects and edit the score and things like that. So we need to create an awake instance the same way that we did earlier on with the target controller. We're then going to make the bird into a prefab, which is a template game object, and then delete that from the scene. That means that we can make the raycast script when the game starts to randomly spawn a bird for us and place it in an undesignated location. So when a bird is also killed, we'll then create a function that will spawn a new bird after waiting for approximately 3 seconds. Once we spawned a new bird, we need to make sure that it appears in the correct location in the hierarchy so that it's scaled in proportion and it appears under the image target. We're then going to play the sound effects for when you press the fire button, and we're going to check if you're allowed to press the fire button again within a couple of seconds while the sound effect is reloading the shotgun. Once that's done, we're then going to use the camera and create a raycast, and we're going to set the point of the raycast to be the center of the screen. We've already added the gun to the scene, but what we're going to do is we're going to add a gun flash target to the tip of the gun, because what I want to happen is when you press the fire button, I want some smoke to come out of the end of the gun. And we're going to use a particle system to generate that effect. Now, once that's done, we're going to make that particle system a prefab itself so that we can spawn the effect of the gun flash every time we press the fire button. We're then going to finally test this on our Android or iOS devices. So let's get straight into it with the first section of creating variables. So what I want you to do is click on Raycast and then double click on the Raycast controller, and we're going to go to the top and we're going to create a bunch of variables. And the first one is going to be a public float, and this will be the maximum distance that our ray can fire. And I'm going to set that to be 100. Now that's because if the camera's all the way back, then the full length of the terrain will be 100 grid units. Now we also want to make sure that we can access this variable, this script, via other game objects. So what I want to do is also make a public static version of this Raycast controller, and we're going to call that instance in the same way that we did previously. We also need to detect what we've actually hit. So to do that, we're going to create a public text field. Now this will go red for now. There we go. And this is to tell us the name of the object, hopefully the bird name. Now it's red because text is part of the user interface. And there's two ways to fix this. What we need to do is up at the top, make sure that we're using the Unity Engine's UI library, which has all the functions that handles the text. But if I just delete that for a second, I'm going to show you an alternate way to fix this. 9 times out of 10, when you have something in red, if it's not a function, it means that we're missing a library up at the top. And if you hold down the control key and click, then MonoDevelop can actually detect this and resolve that for us, saying, do we need to include Unity Engine's UI? And it will write the code at the top for us, which is really cool and really handy later on. Now, like I said, when we press the fire button, I want to give some kind of smoke effect to come out of the end of the shotgun. So we're going to need a location to actually display the particle effect. So I'm going to create a public transform, which will be the actual gun flash target. And that way we're going to create a game object at the end of the gun where we will spawn the instance of the particle system. The next thing that we're going to need is to make sure that they can't repeatedly press the fire button. So I'm going to set a public float, which will be the fire rate. And I want to make sure that the animation has time to play the sound effect. And just over 1.5 seconds is about right for this particular sound effect that was included in the assets. The next thing that we're going to need is to make sure that they are allowed to take their next shot, and this time has actually passed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an additional private boolean, meaning it's true or false, and I'm going to call that next shot, and initially set it to true because they will be allowed to fire the first time. Now once they've fired the button, we're going to set next shot to be false until 1.6 seconds have passed by, giving time for the sound effect of the gun to complete before we then set next shot back to be true so that the user can actually fire again. And as I mentioned earlier on the canvas, we added a text area in the bottom left hand corner that I wanted to use for debugging, and this was to display the object name of what we actually hit. Now this Raycast script is what's going to handle that. So the next thing that we need to do, because we've created this static instance, is once again we need to create the awake function to make sure that other scripts can access this one, and then call the functions that are inside it. So what I want to say is if instance is null, then I want you to set the instance inside this script to equal this particular file's object. Okay, cool. So let's have a quick look what's next on the list. Okay, now we need to make the bird into a prefab, and we're going to create a coroutine called spawn new bird. So let's come back to the scene, into the 3D view, and double click on the bird asset. Now, We left the bird on the scene originally so that we could see it flying around, but it doesn't need to be there when the game first loads. I want you to click on the Assets folder and I want you to look for the one called Resources. If you don't have one, right click and create a folder and call it Resources with a capital R. This is a folder that's specifically reserved for Unity, where we can save objects into here which we will use to then load on the fly and spawn into the game. So go inside the Resources folder and drag our bird asset into there. That will create a new version of the game object which includes the box collider and the script attached that we did. You can now delete the bird from the scene, as we're going to use code to actually create that. Okay, so back across to the script. Now, when the game first loads, the start command will run. So this is where we're going to spawn the new bird, and we're going to use something called a coroutine. Now, a coroutine is something that's built into MonoDevelop and Unity, and it follows this structure. When the game starts, it will allow the system to call a function without us interfering at all. All we have to do is pass in the name of the function. Well, the name of the function will be spawn new bird. There we go. And although it doesn't exist yet, so it's still in red, we're about to fix that. Now, I'll introduce you to something new now. Instead of a void or a public void, a coroutine requires something a little bit different. Now, what a coroutine uses is something called an IEnumerator. Now, because we only want this to actually be allowed to be called within this specific class, then rather than making it public, we're going to make it private. So instead of it being a private void or a public void, it's going to be a private IEnumerator. Okay, and this is a set system. Now, the enumerator that we're going to call is spawn new bird, which is the new function. Okay, and it has a very specific structure to the function, sorry. Now, an IEnumerator needs to yield, which basically means wait, and then return back to the original function. And what we can tell it to do is to wait for a number of seconds before running the code that follows this line. Now, we're going to wait for approximately 3 seconds before spawning a bird. So when the game first loads, you will hold up the target, you will be able to see the world. Well, you won't hold up the target realistically. The target will be on the table or something. You'll hold up the phone and you will detect the world. You will then have a few seconds to move the camera back so that you can see the actual scene, and then the bird will spawn. Also, if you shoot a bird, then there'll be a 3-second delay before a new one is generated. Okay, so all we have to do now is make sure that we spawn the bird. And if you start a line with a double slash, then that's how we can leave little comments for ourselves. So why not do that? This next line of code is going to spawn the bird. So we're going to create a game object, and I'm going to call it new bird. Now, the way that we actually spawn something is by using something called instantiate. Now, instantiate allows us to load something from that resources folder. If I can spell the word resources. And we're going to call the function to load. And all we have to do is pass in the name of the item that we want to load. And provided it's in the right area, meaning we've saved the prefab into the correct resources folder, then all we have to do is actually name what we want to load. Now, I'll just double check the name as it's case sensitive. Bird asset underscore uppercase. Yep, spot on. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is tell it what type of object this will be. Well, this is going to actually be a game object. There we go, so close that one. close the load and then close the instantiate and set that as a game object. Okay, now that will spawn a bird onto the scene as soon as the game runs. The problem is we don't know where in the hierarchy it needs to spawn. So we need to tell the game object, the new game object, what to use as its parent so that it appears under the image target. So let's do that now. What we need to do is we need to make the bird a child of the image target. There we go. So a nice little comment for us. And the new bird, what we're going to do is set the transform on the game object to use the parent for another game object. And then what we have to do is find the game object in the hierarchy that we want to use. So we're going to use the find command where we can simply give it the name of the other game object in the hierarchy that we want this to be a child of. Well, the game object we want this to be a child of is actually the image target. Now make sure you spell this correctly and it's case sensitive, otherwise everything's going to go wrong for you. So from this game object, how do we actually set our transform to be the underneath this game objects? Well, we need to go after the transform in that as well. Now, when the bird is spawned, it will appear underneath the image target in the list, which is exactly where we want it. So all we need to do now is make sure that the scale is correct. Now, this is always a little bit tricky because every time I create a scene, the scale of the bird is slightly different, so it's a little bit of trial and error this next section, but we'll get there. We just need to give it a bit of a starting block. So I'm going to set the new bird's transform to be a local scale which expects an X, Y and a Z size. So I'm going after, well, if I show you on the target focus, I'm going after this, this and this line. So come back for a second. So the local scale expects a vector 3, which is an X, Y and a Z. So let's make it a new vector 3 and we'll set that to be about 10F on the X and about 10 on the Y and about 10 on the Z, and we'll just see how the size of the bird actually sits on the scene, whether it's too big, too small, and we can adjust this figure if we need to. Okay, the next thing that I want to do is, like we did with the cube, give it a random start position. So we need to create another vector 3 in the same way that we did earlier, called temp. And then we're going to give it the same type of random location. So we've actually already got this code. If I come across to the target collider, I can just take this and place it underneath. Now, all I need to do is make sure that we're going after the new bird's transform position rather than the raycast transform position. The position, sorry, not permission. Okay, so that's that. So now what's going to happen is this script will run. It will load in a bunch of variables which we need to assign. Then it will start a coroutine which will wait for 3 seconds and then load the bird asset in. It will then find the transform of the image target and place the bird's transform underneath that as its parent. And then we want to give it a random start position so that every time we play the game, it's a little bit different. Okay, so far so good. Let's jump into our plan and see what's next. Okay, play sound, and then we're passing in an integer sound. Okay, so what I want to do now, let's go back up here. I'm going to create a function to play the sounds.